Welcome to E+T Off the Page. Has science fiction influenced technology? This is a podcast series and it's our chance as an editorial team to chat about a featured topic in the most recent issue of E+T magazine. Now, the issue that's just come out has used the centenary of Disney and the 60-year anniversary of Doctor Who to take a look at how technology has played its role in entertainment and how entertainment, specifically science fiction, has inspired technology. So, first of all, let me introduce you to the editorial team. First of all, Bea Valero. Bea, what's your relationship with science fiction?
Hi, hello, I'm Bea. I'm a reporter at E+T. I'd say I'm usually more of a fantasy person, but I do like science fiction movies and especially books.
Nice, good. And Jack, you're our strong card here, I think. Introduce yourself, Jack Loughran.
Yeah, well, I've always loved science fiction. I've been watching it since I was a little kid. I used to be obsessed with Doctor Who and Star Wars and all the kind of obvious stuff. The Matrix, I suppose, was my real love. I watched that film probably more than any other. So, yeah, I've pretty much liked science fiction for as long as I can remember. So,
fair enough. Well, I've got to say, from my point of view, I've always enjoyed elements of science fiction. I sometimes find that science fiction often comes with that dystopian backdrop, which I sometimes find a little bit depressing. The future never looks all that good in a science fiction film, does it? But it's always nice to see some flying cars, some doors that make swishing noises, but sometimes it just seems a bit sterile, don't you think, the future? Bea?
Yeah, I agree that sometimes it could feel a bit scary in a way, the future, but I also think that science fiction really usually reflects the present and kind of what people are worried about at the moment. And they're, at the end of the day, just stories, and it's a way to frame them in a different way, look at the problems that we have today in a different light with things such as AI and automation and other real-world problems.
yeah, I think that's interesting because if you look at the last 200 years, I mean, most people's lives, your average person's life has been drastically improved through technology, like medical technology, agriculture, and now, obviously, in the last 50 years or so, computing technology. And I think it's interesting that, life expectancy in even the poorest countries of the world has been rocketing, and people's quality of life has been rocketing. And yet all science fiction ever wants to talk about is how awful technology is and how it's going to bring an end to the human race. So, I don't know. I think that is interesting.
It's an interesting dilemma, isn't it? So why can't it be a little bit more positive, perhaps, than it is portrayed? But science fiction, has it played a role in inspiring the future? Do you think? Then has it? Did the science fiction come first, and the technology has caught up?
Well, I want to talk about what's often considered to be the first science fiction film, which is A Trip to the Moon, which was made in 1902. It's actually the year before the Wright brothers did the first flight. So I'd say, and then obviously, 1902, when was the first moon landing? 1969. So
69, yes.
I mean, the film is a bit quaint by today's standards, I think. That they go to the moon and they meet sort of the moon people who live there, and they're just silly people in silly costumes. It's probably not dated the best, but since it is considered to be the first science fiction film, I thought it probably was a good place to start. And you might recognise it from there was a film about 10 years ago called Hugo, which that film is part of the plot in that, and it's got a picture of one of the main sort of images from the film is basically the moon with a face in it and with a like rocket in its eye, and that's the way the film starts, basically, where the main characters load themselves into a massive gun, and they're then shot to the moon with a huge gun, and the capsule they're in lands in the eye of the moon, and then they get out and meet all these slightly odd characters on the surface. But it got me thinking, is that plausible? Could you make a massive gun that would allow you to travel into space? I mean, obviously, we've always used rockets, but so I took a look into it. And it turns out that in the early 60s, there was this project called Project HARP, which was basically exactly that, which is a massive gun designed to shoot payloads into space. I don't know if either of you heard of this before.
No, first time.
I certainly hadn't heard of it, but I don't know. I mean, I wonder how much a trip to the moon actually helped inspire this, or whether it was just a Cold War competition. But I would imagine it's probably the latter. But the interesting thing about that was it was a joint venture between the US and Canadian Defence Departments. It was built in 1962 on an island in Barbados. And it was built intentionally near the equator so that it could fire projectiles into space, and you would get extra velocity from being fired near the equator due to the Earth's rotation, or at least that was a theory anyway. And yeah, Project HARP, it lasted a few years. In the end, the test firings, they started out reaching only altitudes of about 26 kilometers. But in the end, they got to over 100 kilometers, which is legitimate space. So, this gun was absolutely huge. It had a 16-inch gun barrel. And they used to carry out numerous firings from the gun, and each firing cost only $2,500, which is incredibly cheap in terms of sending projectiles into space, even though admittedly that's now about $25,000 in today's money. Tim?
But you have to be incredibly accurate. If you're firing a gun at the moon and you miss, you've got a whole load of astronauts who are heading out into deep space and nothing to stop them after that. So you've got to be good. And there's a lot of difference between 100 kilometers and all the distance to the moon as well. But one of the things I find interesting actually is, as a point of reference, we used to run a series in E+T called Big Screen, and it was looking at science fiction movies and some of the technology that was in them and whether it either was possible or it could be possible in the future. And it's one of the interesting things about science fiction is how elements of it are framed in the time that they were set. This is what you were saying, Bayer, wasn't it? And I'm sure the moon film back a century and more ago was the same. But we looked at this film, Ready Player One, which I really enjoyed actually. But it was from a book that was substantially before the internet was really pervasive, and basically the story was about the dystopian world that I'm so fond of, as you know, was so grim that everybody retreated to the metaverse. But the kind of the silly thing about it was to get into this metaverse, then people were going to internet cafes. And the actual film was produced, I think it was 2011, so 4G was just coming in. 5G hadn't been heard of, and the power that it gives to communications. But it was even 12, 13 years ago, it was an age when internet cafes were an important consideration. And when you look back on that now, it looks a bit foolish and a bit dated.
Yes, that's what I find fascinating about science fiction books and movies that were written back in the day, and now we go back at them and see what they thought the future would be like. For example, I just read this past weekend The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for the first time, and one of the most famous lines talks about how humans are obsessed with digital watches. And because it was a new edition, they had some notes. The book had some notes at the end talking about just notes from the editor and comments on one of the manuscripts. And they were talking about whether they should replace digital watches for something more modern, because they were worried that would make the book look dated. They concluded at the end that it was just too famous a line to replace, but I find it super interesting. Also, you have things like 2001, The Space Odyssey, which was obviously made in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, about 2001, which is has come and gone far past, and obviously the world looks nothing like what they thought it would look like at the time. But there's something interesting that in that movie, there's an iPad or something that looks like an iPad or a tablet. And when Apple, not that long ago, in like 2011, sorry, when they presented some of the iPads, and then Samsung wanted to do a similar device, and then there was a huge legal case about whether Samsung had infringed Apple's patent on the design of the iPad. And Samsung quoted the movie 2001, The Space Odyssey, as an example of previous art that would invalidate Apple's patent. They lost, but I thought it was really interesting how it did exist before Apple designed its product. Obviously, we don't know if it was a direct reference for Apple or not, but it was there, and you can see the frames. And they also used FaceTime, or what they call voice user interface and communications, in the movie that obviously we now use today.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very prescient film, actually. Especially, I mean, obviously the AI element of it as well. You know, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that, and all that stuff. I mean, that's kind of like a Google Home sort of precursor type thing. Maybe a slightly more evil one, or maybe not. To be fair, I don't know.
Maybe not.
Google doesn't have the best reputation.
But AI has been present in science fiction movies for years, even though we've now been mostly talking about it. It feels very new topic, that conversation that now it's in everyone's mouth. But we've seen movies for years talking about this. We have Ex Machina and Blade Runner, like, are machines going to take over the world? That's kind of a big theme in science fiction, I think. And I personally think it's because, in my opinion, sometimes science fiction can get quite philosophical. And in a way, humans have always defined themselves by how smart we are and all the things we can make, as opposed to maybe animals or other creatures. While, like, what happens when machines are smarter than we are? Then what defines us? Like, what does it mean to be human? And I think a lot of movies about robots touch on that.
Well, they do. And the interesting one is artificial intelligence itself, isn't it? The Spielberg film. And I think that was 20 years ago. And even then it was based on a book that was 30 years even before that. And it's about an adorable boy, really, who just wants to be loved. That's basically what it's about. But for Spielberg to be doing it 20 years ago, and the book 50 years ago, or whatever, it shows a softer side, doesn't it? Because one of the things maybe we'll come on to talk about is the fear element of science fiction, and AI very rarely does anything to do with AI reflect well on what AI potentially could do. It's normally, this is the rise of the machines type stuff, and it doesn't end well.
I find the boy in AI not adorable, to be honest. I find him, that film is just so schmaltzy. It's so schmaltzy.
All right, he's meant to be adorable then.
Well, it's like, you know, Steven Spielberg often gets a bit schmaltzy, doesn't he? Let's be honest.
Does he?
But at the end of that film, I seem to remember the entire human race has effectively been wiped out, and the boy is pretty much the last remaining element of it, until some aliens come down and resurrect his mum for a day. And it's I don't know. The less said about the ending of AI, the better, probably. But yeah.
True, but even with, like, in the Hitchhiker's Guide as well, the whole Earth kind of gets destroyed, and the main character goes and explores the universe. But I really liked it because at the end of the day, like, the aliens have kind of the same problems that the humans have. They're like, they look different and have different technology and tools and things like that. But the big societal problems are very, very similar.
Well, I think you could talk about Star Trek actually in those terms as well, because the thing about we mentioned earlier how sci-fi often focuses on the dystopian. Whereas actually the interesting thing about Star Trek is that it's kind of set after humanity has reached a utopia. And I think the problem with utopias as a plot point in general is that there's inherently no drama in it. Because if it's a utopia, everyone's having a great time. So how can you make an interesting plot in a utopia? And the way they do that in Star Trek, of course, is by visiting other planets and visiting aliens that, as you said, have kind of problems that are analogous to those that humans suffer from. So yeah, I don't know.
Yes, that's. I know Timmy dislike dystopias, but at the end of the day, if you're writing a story, you need the hero to fight against something, and the easiest way is to have an evil government or a society that has a problem that needs to be fixed. Although in Star Trek, I do have a fun fact, which was that the TV show debuted a flip phone in the 1966, which they called at the time the communicator. I'll admit I haven't watched the show, but apparently 30 years later, Motorola launched the first mobile flip phone. And in a nod to the series, they called it the StarTAC. So they clearly at least admitted to be somewhat inspired by the TV show.
I think the thing about the communicators, I mean, especially from that first series from the 60s, is that they're actually, real technology has eclipsed them quite considerably. I mean, you know, a smartwatch is considerably smaller and more advanced than a communicator, and you can have smartwatches where you can they can connect via 4G and make phone calls, etc. So I think it's interesting. I mean, Star Trek's obviously set very far in the future, and yet they couldn't envisage real technology that would come about within a matter of decades.
Indeed. Don't you think there is, and I've got a couple of examples of this, there's different sorts of science fiction, isn't there? There is the grittier, realistic sort, and then there's the stuff that's bordering on the fantasy science fiction, if you like. And then there is also the stuff that is just plain silly. And you could, well, there is, isn't there? I mean, if you think about so much that goes on in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it is just plain silly. Or is it? Is the thing, because I was just in the news last week was Elon Musk has introduced his new chatbot. I don't think it's actually released yet, but it's on its way, and he's called it Grok in a nod to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it's a chatbot with a rebellious streak. Apparently, you know, it's a sarcastic streak like Marvin, the paranoid android. That's one example. Another one, and Jack, you went to see Huawei a couple of weeks ago, looking at some of their new technology. And one of the most engaging bits of technology, if you want to call it technology, in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the Babel fish. Or the Babel fish. So you put the fish in your ear and it automatically translates. Now, obviously, fish isn't technology, but the technology is beginning to replicate that, isn't it, Jack? Didn't you see Huawei doing some astonishing translation?
I did. I saw them as a phone call carried out over 5G, and effectively two people speaking in different languages could communicate as if they were both speaking their mother tongue. So one person would be speaking, and what they were saying would be instantly converted into the language of the other caller, and then vice versa. So effectively, it was Babel fish over a phone call. I mean, this was like more of a technology demo that Huawei were unveiling, but they did say to me actually that it's something they hope to launch next year. And frankly, I mean, I'm sure that kind of thing will become quite commonplace a few years down the line. I mean, it seems like an obvious use of translation technology, especially when you look at things like Google Translate. I mean, I've been using Google Translate off and on for quite a long time, and every time I use it, it's slightly better than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
There's other aspects of science fiction, I think, isn't there? That and some of them, like time travel and space travel. There are a couple of the key factors, aren't they, in science fiction? And my personal opinion is that there will never be time travel because the future has never visited us. So there just can't be. And space travel equally. Well, if you don't mind, I've written down a note here. The closest extrasolar planet to Earth that could have potentially life is Proxima Centauri b, which is 4.2 light years away, and the fastest man-made object is NASA's Parker Solar Probe, which travels at nearly 400,000 miles an hour. So even if we could hitch a ride on the Parker Solar Probe, it would take us about 7,100 years to get to the closest planet that might have life, and obviously be pretty disappointed if we got there and there was nobody in. So space travel, as far as we know, or linear space travel, I think is just something that we can't really comprehend. Although there is arguments as well that we don't understand quantum physics properly yet, and there is a notion that if you can't travel through space, then make space travel around you and bend the space and things like that. And there's
using wormholes and all that kind of thing.
All that sort of thing, yes. And that was actually another reference to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is that the spaceship. What was it again, Bear? You just read it. Heart of Glass.
Heart of Gold.
Heart of Gold, yes. Was Heart of Glass was a Blondie song. I remember that. Yes, that had an improbability drive on it.
But yeah, and in that concept, when you were talking, I was thinking about how even if life existed somewhere in the galaxy, then what would be the probability that we were able to develop technology to go into that place and reach there at the same time that life existed in that other place? Like, the probability of that happening is probably extremely small. Maybe life has happened and has been extant, or will happen in the future, and then we'll just miss each other. And also, maybe it does exist, but it's not just what we recognize ourselves as life, because even science fiction is written by humans, so we can only imagine things that are, in a way, kind of similar to what's around us.
But the other thing about Hitchhiker's Guide is didn't they effectively destroy the Earth in order to build an intergalactic motorway?
Yes, so what's hilarious about that, and what I was saying about having the same problems on Earth and in space, is that the main character, it opens with him getting his house destroyed because they were going to build like a highway or something. So it's like in a small level, but then the Earth gets destroyed because they're building an intergalactic highway. So it's kind of the same thing happening at just like different orders of magnitude.
Well, the people complain about NIMBYism when it comes to massive infrastructure projects. And I guess in that case, the human race would be NIMBYs, probably.
Yeah. But in that book also, apparently Earth is just like a macro computer, and it's all run by mice. And humans are just, we don't realize that mice are actually the smartest race on Earth, and they're controlling us. So.
Okay. I thought that was dolphins.
No, so it goes mice, then dolphins, then humans.
Right, okay.
Fair enough. What about the fear factor with science fiction? We touched on it a little bit earlier with AI. Is it a lack of understanding of technology? And this is, again, going back to your point, Bea, about how science fiction reflects what's going on in society today. A lot of society today doesn't really understand or trust a lot of technology, and when they don't understand it, then they start to fear it, perhaps.
Yes, in a way, I think maybe technology is not the problem. It's just how you use it and how you regulate it. I wrote an article for the new issue of the magazine about using AI to write movies, and I was talking to different writers and script writers about their concerns, and most of them agreed that AI will be used in the creative arts, if not now, at some point. But it was just about getting an agreement of how to regulate it, what data is used to feed those algorithms, and then how are the people that create that material compensated, and then just making sure that it's all done as ethically as possible in a way.
Well, I think the interesting thing about the concerns over AI and surveillance to an extent as well. So if you look at 1984, every room has a camera and a screen in it, so which basically lets the regime constantly promote their own what do you call it?
Just like control the population.
No,
Authoritarian regime.
what's it called when you have like adverts that are I've totally lost propaganda. There you go.
Okay.
Propaganda. And the idea in that is you couldn't enter a room without having a camera that has been installed by the state. And actually, I mean, people talk about 1984 a lot as being very prescient, I think, to today's technological culture. But I mean, personally, no one forced me to have a Google Home in every single room in my house. I just decided to do that off my own bat. And, I know that Google are furiously data collecting from me, and that they could effectively listen to every word I say in the comfort of my own home if they so chose to. And so maybe that's the interesting thing, that rather than forcing people to have a sort of surveillance culture, possibly with AI in tow when it comes to Google Home, people just invite it into their own homes. People are perfectly happy to introduce it as long as they feel like it gives them some minor benefit, such as being able to turn off your lights with your voice.
But I think the problem with that is that the people aren't understanding it. There's we did one of our infographics. We ran after your feature, Bea, and it was showing that there's huge differences in across the world in who understands AI, and the ones who do understand it don't have that same level of fear about losing their jobs or the associated surveillance, Big Brother stuff, that people in countries that don't understand AI. So, maybe because we've seen films, as you're saying, Jack, like 1984, where we've seen technology used at an extreme, then science fiction does help fuel the fear. And another point on
well, the fear of the unknown is greater than fear of what's known, even if you know that what's known has potential negative ramifications. That's probably a bit of a mouthful, to be honest. But
but our world is changing so fast. I think science fiction as a genre especially began flourishing. Obviously, you have science fiction books back into the 19th century, things like Frankenstein and things like that. And I think back in the day, maybe people weren't so afraid of the future because they were expecting the future to look very similar to their present day, because change didn't happen as quickly. Which is now, if you look at what society looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was so vastly different than then looking 50 years into the future. It feels like we don't know what it could look like, because the possibilities are in a way endless, because technology is advancing at such a rapid pace. So maybe we're just afraid of change.
Yeah, you do see that. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, for example, if you look at sci-fi from the 1960s, everyone's in a flying car, but they're still using little twiddly knobs and things rather than touchscreen computers. And it's like there's a sort of projection of the future, but it's like taking the 60s and projecting it into the future, and you also see that in H.G. Wells books and stuff that are more like early 20th century. Everything's cogs and wheels and things rather than microchip technology, which is of course the reality of how those technologies are brought into existence.
Yeah, and Back to the Future, the second movie where they go into like an alternative future, I guess. Everything's very futuristic and it's like holograms and little like gadgets that are very similar to what we use today in terms of wearables, but the general society looks very similar to ours, or the 80s, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
The 90s.
Yeah.
What the 80s thought the 90s would be.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask you both a question about favourites, or best and worst. What are the best and worst science fiction films ever? And I'll kick that one off, and I'll just say that my own personal favourite, unfortunately, and I've got a feeling that you'll disapprove of me for liking it so much, but I just love Jurassic Park. Never seen dinosaurs before, so I think between that and Terminator 2 was an absolutely thrilling movie, but it was great from a technology point of view as well.
Oh, no complaints there, Tim. I don't think anyone can dispute the quality of Jurassic Park and Terminator 2. And actually, Jurassic Park's an interesting one because I think it as well as being a sci-fi film, it also kind of pointed to the future of films, because the CGI in that at the time is phenomenal. And actually, even if you watch it now, the CGI holds up pretty well. And that's partly due to kind of clever use of animatronics spliced in with CGI. But I mean, yeah, I think that's fair enough. Terminator 2 is pretty much undoubtedly the best action film of all time. And I think probably most people would agree with that statement, despite it being quite strong.
Any other? I was going to throw in while it was on my pitch that I also quite like some of the old fashioned. We were talking about, in some ways, the 60s were kind of a golden age for sci-fi, because that's when people really started thinking about space travel, and they were looking at a bigger picture than they were looking at before, perhaps.
And computers were entering a...
Yeah, just about. But one particular one from that, from a John Wyndham book, was the book was Midwich Cuckoos, and the film was Village of the Damned. They remade that a few years back, I think, didn't they? Which I haven't seen. But the original one was chilling. It was fantastic. I remember really liking that. I'm not sure if that counts really as science fiction. It was just a bit weird, really. But it was. I love that one.
I'd say yes, probably more horror.
Yeah, maybe.
I really liked Arrival. I know it's not one of the classic ones, but I love the linguistic aspect of it, and it just felt a bit more realistic in a way, and like more on the practical side. Like, okay, if we encounter aliens, then how do we talk to them? And just the idea that a language can also affect the concepts of time, and I love the plot twist at the end. So
I think the other great thing about Arrival is just how alien the aliens are.
That's so true. They don't look like
if you
humanoids, but green.
Exactly. If you watch Star Trek, it's just people with crinkly noses, and other than that, they're identical to humans. Whereas, they're kind of weird jellyfish creatures or something.
Yeah,
I mean, I haven't seen it since it came out, but
I haven't seen it in a while. But yeah, they're like really huge, and they couldn't figure out how to speak to them, and even their language affects how they interpret time and things like that. So yeah, they're very different organisms, which I think is a way more realistic.
How about you, Jack? Any favourites?
Well, I mean, I brought up The Matrix earlier, which I just love The Matrix. I think that's got to be my number one sci-fi film, to be honest. I don't know, just everything about it. I mean, the reveal sort of halfway through the film where you realise that reality isn't reality. I mean, and of course you can draw parallels with the interesting thing about The Matrix, actually, and one of the things that always bothered me about The Matrix was that the explanation in the film for why humans had been effectively cocooned by the robots and plumbed into the Matrix was so they could act as a sort of organic battery where the heat or body heat or whatever was was harvested from the humans in order to power the machines effectively. But in terms of physics, this doesn't really make sense because basically if you're like you the energy you take in as a human, you don't put out more heat than the energy you consume, so it doesn't really make sense if you see what I mean. If you think, I probably thought about the Matrix slightly too hard, but but I did read once that the original idea was that the humans would actually be plumbed into a sort of a cloud computer interface, basically, so that actually the machines were effectively using brain power as a sort of massive computer that the machines used for their own intelligence. But apparently the Wachowski brothers thought this concept was too complex, and so this is why they changed it for the battery explanation in the film. But I think if the film was made now, I think people would absolutely understand the concept of cloud computing, or at least more than they did in 1999. So
yeah, I think so. It definitely has some science behind it. One of my favorite sections of the magazine is our column on the evil engineer, and I love that they actually go and look at just some of behind the scenes physics and technology that is behind these ideas that seem incredibly wild.
I think outside of the Matrix as well, I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time, but it is good, is The Martian, which was
very good,
which was a few years ago. And I think what's quite nice about that is actually nothing in that is too outlandish. I mean, it's about a guy trying to survive on the planet Mars, but you know, I think they may have taken a few liberties in that film with certain things, but a lot of it is kind of realistic. Like the length of time. I mean, part of it's just the length of time it takes to travel to Mars and back, and for the rescue mission to come. I mean, it just takes years and years. And all. I think it's quite interesting to kind of look at technology in that way, just pushing it just a very slight bit forward with The Martian. So it's kind of all quite plausible, really. Whereas stuff that we've been talking about already, like even Jurassic Park, Terminator, The Matrix, it's all pretty far out stuff that does not seem like it's about to happen anytime soon.
Some companies are already doing commercial flights to space, maybe not to Mars. And that's proven quite popular. And I'm curious about what do you think? Would you be willing to go maybe to the moon or to Mars, even if it took several years of your life? Do you think it's a worth it experience?
I'd love to go to space. Maybe cheeky trip to the moon. But I think Mars, I don't know if I'd want to give up.
It feels too much.
A few years of my life for that. And also, I don't know, I do slightly wonder, I'd have to get on with the people on board pretty damn well.
It's a close space.
Otherwise, we're all just going to end up killing each other, aren't we? By the time we get there.
And it's not going to be that great when you get there. I mean, you might feel like a pioneer and an outlier for the human race and all the rest of it, but it's going to be pretty damn dull, isn't it? Let's be honest.
I mean, that's why we haven't been back to the moon since 1972 or something. We went a few times, ultimately realised, yeah, it's just like a bunch of rocks and dust and stuff.
Well, now they want to create a new lunar colony in the moon. NASA wants to go back. It's kind of the whole process behind the Artemis program. Although I guess they just want to use it as a base to get materials, which we're always in need of, and also to power future missions to Mars.
That's true, yeah.
But I wanted to pick on something that you said a minute ago about the outlandish technology in Jurassic Park and Terminator 2. Terminator 2's got the time travel element to it, or the Terminator films all do, and I think we've agreed that doesn't happen. But the cyborg and the robotics and the AI within that gelling together of AI and robotics is it can be quite a potent thing. The metal that Terminator 2 is, or the T3 is made. Is it the T3? Is that right? It's made out of the one that comes back after the Terminator. You know the one that I mean, anyway. And in Jurassic World as well, the cloning aspect as well. They have realised that 65 million year old DNA doesn't exist. But in the film, they did fill in the gaps with frogs, I think, or newts, something like that. And you know, since Michael Crichton wrote the book, which wasn't that long before the actual film, which again I think is 20 odd years ago now.
30.
30, is it? But Dolly the sheep has been born since then, and there is, technology has moved past that. But maybe, if the question was, did the science fiction inspire reality? Then reality was very much moving in that direction, and I think that's true with a lot of the things that we're talking about. Maybe we can finish off with that in a minute. But I did want to ask.
Can I just add one point to that?
Yep.
Just a little one. Barbara Streisand has been talking about her new book and been doing a media campaign over the last few days, and it turned out that she cloned her dog twice because her dog died, and she loved it so much she got it cloned at a cost of $250,000, and then that one died, and then she cloned it again. So
Wow.
Cloning is an option if you've got the cash.
So is nobody asking, why is your dog 30 years old? That's a world record. Who knows? What about that question? You can't really answer what is the worst sci-fi movie, because there's going to be so many B movies that barely saw the light of day. But are there any that you think were hugely overrated, or you didn't have much time for? And I really am going to alienate people by saying I have tried so many times, not so many times because I've given up now, but Star Wars. To watch that I've tried to watch it chronologically in the order that they were made, and I just get bored and can't see it through. The original Star Wars film, I'll give them that one, but after that.
Well, the thing about Star Wars, I mean, I'd kind of argue it's not really sci-fi. Like, force powers are effectively magic. I'd kind of argue it's a fantasy series with a sort of sci-fi skin on top. I mean, there are spaceships and stuff, but the focus is never really on the science, and the focus is always on the battle between good and evil, which is a very fantasy thing. I mean, in terms of Star Wars, last year I watched Andor, which is a TV show on Disney Plus, and that for me was by far the best Star Wars thing that's ever been made, including the original films. And I know people would hate me for saying that, but that's more actually sci-fi. There's none of this Force rubbish. It's like I'd call that a sci-fi show. But yeah, in terms of stuff I think's overrated. I mean, it's always the sequels, isn't it, really? So, like, Star Wars 1 is good. Star Wars Episode 9 is atrocious. Well, Star Wars 1 or Star Wars Episode 4, it gets all complicated, prequels, sequels, but you know what I'm saying. The first Star Wars film. I mean, Alien is an incredible film, but by the time you get to Alien 4, it's total trash. Terminators 3, 4, 5, and 6, none of them are particularly good. 6 is all right. 6 is better than the preceding 3 films. I think it's the sequels that really let these shows down. I mean, The Matrix is another one. It's probably good sometimes just to let things rest,
I do really like Star Wars, but I agree with you that it feels more of an alternative universe rather than a realistic future of our universe in a way. I do like, especially the original trilogy and the prequels. I'm a fan. I think the science fiction, if you call it that, I've never really got into was superhero movies on Marvel, which they feel to not be able to commit on whether they wanted to actually be sci-fi or they want to be fantasy. They seem to have elements here and there, especially things like Iron Man, when it's like technology has developed so much and it has evolved. But at the same time, they still want to keep the world very realistic. So I'm not the biggest fan of those movies.
No, I think that's a fair point. Iron Man being the first film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'd say it's fair to describe that as a sci-fi film, because there's a lot of discussion over how he's making the suit, and even though the technology is somewhat ridiculous, it does try and bed that in reality. And once you got getting to Thor and guy coming down with a big hammer and stuff, it's just silly, isn't it? But
okay, let's finish this off now with. We've talked around the houses here. What is the verdict? Is science fiction a driver for the technology for tomorrow?
I think science fiction is a driver for human imagination and inspiration, and anything that drives creativity ultimately drives technological development as well. So I would say yes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. I don't think it is a driver for technology itself. It is, or for science. It is a driver for scientists. I think even if you see these Star Wars conventions, all full of these strange people dressed up in different ways, or Transformers, or any of these sorts of things, I bet in those crowds there is a whole load of coders and computer sciences and crypto scientists of the future and that sort of thing. I think science fiction attracts and promotes the imagination of people rather than worrying too much about the technology itself.
Yes, and those people that read those books and watch these movies, maybe doing that sparks the creativity or the idea to actually build the machines, because at the end of the day, it is humans who build all of the technology, at least for the time being.
Well, I suppose, sci-fi and technology probably both come from people kind of dreaming about what they could make. So they kind of come from the same place. But yeah, I think sci-fi is more of something that influences scientists to develop the next thing rather than something that directly impacts the future of technology in itself.
Okay. All right. Bea, Jack, thank you very much. Thank you for listening to E+T Off the Page. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe. And you can also read daily news and the latest issue of the magazine on www.entmagazine.com. Thank you very much.